You think a woman can handle pressure like this? The commander's voice sliced through the war room, cold and dismissive. Elena's ballistic charts were slapped off the table, scattering across the floor. Mocking laughter echoed until sirens wailed warning of an imminent nuclear launch. Elena steadied her hands on the rifle, sliding it into position with calm precision. Through the scope, the world shrank to a single target shimmering in the heat. Her breath slowed, heartbeat matching the countdown. She pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder, the bullet screaming across 3,000 meters into the horizon. 3 seconds stretched into eternity. Then silence, as the world waited to see if one woman's shot could stop the end. This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. They said the math didn't belong in the room. The fluorescents hummed overhead, hummingbird bright and unforgiving, while maps flickered on the wall screens. And a dozen men in fleeces and flight jackets angled their chairs away from the woman at the end of the table. Commander Jonathan Iron Maddox stood with his hands braced on the edge, forearms tense, jaw set. His words came fast, blunt, intended to end the conversation. They needed speed, muscle memory, a trigger hand that wouldn't shake when cities were on the line. A woman, he didn't say the word again, but the word hung there, wasn't what this mission demanded. Elena Cruz didn't fill the silence. She stood, slid a manila folder across the table, and spread a fan of pages like a deck of cards. Numbers, wind roses, density altitudes. One sheet showed the bullets plunge in a curve that bit into the paper. S margin, annotated with corrections for spin drift and Earth's rotation. Another diagram traced ridge lines and thermal plumes, a zigzag of potential mirage that could bend sight lines by fractions of a mil. She tapped the stacked figures once, just enough to say, "Look." The senior chief, seated halfway down the table, snorted, hooked 2 fingers under the top page, and tore it cleanly in half. "We don't have time for homework." The halves fluttered down, landing on her boots. For a beat, everything was still. The low throb of the air handler, the faint buzz of a radio. On scan, a pencil rolling until it tapped the chair leg of Petty Officer Daniel Rios. Then the room resumed its rhythm. Someone coughed, someone else checked a watch, and the commander resumed the briefing. Rios, broad-shouldered, confident, the designated marksman, kept his eyes on the big screen where satellite imagery pulsed with time-stamped passes. Elena crouched, collected the torn pages and held them like something fragile and unimportant, then walked to the whiteboard. She didn't look for permission. The cap of the marker clicked off, and the smell of solvent cut through coffee and gun oil. Densities first, temperatures next. She wrote fast, the figures arriving in a clean procession that tasted like familiar ground, a corridor of air that thinned with height. Pressure edges that slid as fronts moved through, the kind of unseen terrain she had learned to read long before she wore a uniform. A straight line became a gentle S-curve where the mountain wind would shear near daybreak. On the TV, a satellite track crawled, insignificant to most eyes. To hers it was a metronome. Maddox's reflection hovered on the glossy screen, hair clipped short, medals reduced to 3 thin bars on a polo. His breast, the outline of a man drilled by years of simple truths. Move quick, hit hard, bring everyone home. He didn't interrupt when Elena tightened the math. The senior chief did. Enough. His palm smacked the board near her shoulder, leaving a chalky print on the glass. We have shooters to place. This isn't a dissertation. It's the only way to hit from the distance you're proposing, Elena said, voice low enough that everyone had to quiet to hear it. Your window isn't a time on your watch. It's when the air stops twisting the path into a question mark. Rios leaned back in his chair until it clicked a notch. And you think you're the one to answer it? I think the numbers don't care who reads them. She underlined a pair of values, then boxed them. At 0907 local, the crosswind aloft dips under 9. The mirage drops with it. The refraction you'll get from the heat on those slabs is still ugly, but if you move the hide 5 meters left of the crest, the angle of incidence keeps the bend under 1/10 of a mil. It's not perfect, it's possible. Someone at the far end muttered that possible wasn't good enough. Maddox stepped away from the screen, and the room came with him.
"We're not here to entertain hypotheticals,"
he said. "We're here to decide who can execute if we're given the shot. Rios, you're on primary. Cruz, you're on overwatch." A thin line, a decision delivered like a verdict. Chairs scraped, folders snapped shut. The meeting dissolved into the clatter of mission prep. Elena recapped the marker. She let the room empty one by one, catching the small glances, the pitying, the dismissive, the cautious, and filing them where she kept everything that didn't belong on the glass, out of sight, not forgotten. When she finally stepped away from the board, the figures remained, a fine-grained skeleton of a path no one else wanted to trust. She slid the torn pages into the folder and left the war room without looking back. The corridor beyond smelled of cold metal and waxed floor. Fluorescents chased each other down the length of the hall, the light pooling in stripes across her boots. In the equipment cage, the armorer handed over her rifle with a nod that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite skepticism, just habit, neutral as a blank target. Elena checked the action, ran a cloth down the bore, and set the bipod angles. With the same quiet precision she used to fold laundry or tune a guitar, every screw had its torque, every line had its place. Her father had taught her that part without words. Sierra Nevada mornings had a hardness to them, light like water on stone. Air so thin it stung the lungs when you ran the switchbacks. He'd set a paper plate on a stump across the gulch, then made her watch the first winds lift dust off the sage until the pattern of it meant something. Count the seconds between gusts. Watch the grass heads bow. Listen to the ravens when they lean into a cross current. If a shot wasn't clean, he'd say, "Bring it closer." He never said smaller. He said closer, and he passed her the same marker she'd held in the briefing room, and he made her write down the wind. She had written it down today. The numbers still lived behind her eyelids as she assembled the rest of her kit, dope cards laminated and edged with tape, so they wouldn't reflect. A small bubble level tied off with a loop of paracord, a lens cloth stitched to her sling. She took the rangefinder the way a violinist takes a case, muscle memory careful, protecting what mattered most. In another room, Rios would be doing his own ritual. Their tools were similar. Their approach was not. By late afternoon, the sky had the blank color of a sheet of steel. The operations bus vibrated around her boots, as if trying to shed its own fatigue. The men packed the benches, gear piled in the aisle. Conversation drifted, a joke about bad coffee, an argument over optics brands, the not-quite-private talk of people who have done this before and will do it again. Elena listened without listening. When the bus braked, the conversation died. Doors snapped open, dust moved in, heat moved out. The forward operating post sat on a ridgeline that bit at the horizon. Below it, the valley ran north-south, ribs of rock pointing the way like the bones of a giant fish. The wind came in pulses, shouldering past, then falling away. Tents hunched under guy lines that thrummed when a gust found them. A weather mast ticked with sensors, its vane twitching to a rhythm you could almost dance to if you weren't counting seconds. She climbed the berm, lay prone, and watched the world turn into the view through glass. She adjusted eye relief until the image snapped into unforgiving focus. Heat shimmer blurred the far ridges, making them appear to breathe. Mirage rose and fell in spires. She tracked nothing in particular for 5 minutes, then 10, teaching her sight to see through the waving. Behind her, a boot heel crunched. Maddox. He squatted without asking if he could. Not close, not far. The brim of his cap cut a straight line across his brow. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wind. "You like writing on my board," he said, tone neutral as a report. "I like being right before I'm loud," she said. He exhaled through his nose, a sound that wasn't a laugh. "You going to be right out here?" "I intend to be. Intend less. Deliver more." He rose, dusted his palm on his pants, and walked away. Orders rolled across the net, cleaned of accent and anger by the radio's compression. Teams moved. Rios took his position with the ease of a man sliding into a familiar chair. Elena didn't move. She leaned the buttstock into the cup of her shoulder until the rifle's heartbeat matched her own. The first reconnaissance drone sliced a white thread across the sky and was gone. The weather report chimed again. The Varney on the mast flirted with 9, then 10, then 9 again. At the bottom of the valley, a strand of road flickered with heat. For a moment it looked like water. She closed her non-shooting eye and watched the mirage straighten when a cloud skated over the sun. The change wasn't much. It was enough to scribble phantom, status. The radio carried Maddox's voice without the gravel. Protocol stripped the names out of it. She toggled transmit. Overwatch set. No movement worth naming. A pause. Copy. She kept the rifle on safe and let her cheek rest against the comb, the coolness of the carbon fiber leaking a little steadiness into her bones. She rehearsed the math again without numbers, a path through disturbed air, a line. That bent and then straightened if you waited for the breath between gusts. That was all this ever was. Breath and patience stacked. The sun crossed the edge of the single cloud and lit the world again. A tiny shadow moved along the far ridge, too small to name and too steady to be anything but human. Elena didn't track it. It wasn't her task to follow people that far with her barrel. Her job, for the moment, was to watch the weather happen to the ground and know when the ground would stop arguing. In the command tent, the planners would be calibrating their hope to fit the latest update. Rios would be checking his level. The senior chief would be doing the same thing he always did before it mattered, standing with his arms crossed and guessing what would go wrong. People did not change. Air did, and that was why people had to learn it, and that was what Elena knew better than anyone on this ridge. The day thinned. Light shifted from white to a brushed nickel shade that made edges glow. A captain walked the line of positions, touching shoulders, murmuring nothing words that mattered anyway. When he reached Elena, he stopped, said nothing at all, then squeezed the toe of her boot with 2 fingers and moved on. It was not approval, it was not doubt, it was simply inclusion. Her radio crackled with a new timbre, the voice from far away, the one that grew calm when stakes climbed. All stations, stand by for tasking update. She didn't move. She didn't blink. The wind eased, then pressed, then eased. Somewhere above and behind, a raven croaked, invisible. She counted to 6, and the raven called again at 4. She filed that away without deciding whether it meant anything. Not every pattern did. She thought of the board back in the room, her handwriting boxed in red where the path might briefly be honest. She thought of the cap of the marker clicking back into place, a small sound made by her own hand to remind the room that certainty came in tiny acts, not speeches. She thought, but only for a moment, of the man who tore her page and how his disgust had nothing to do with algebra. and everything to do with the shape of the person holding the pen. The net brightened with voices as the update flowed down the chain. Times, coordinates, contingencies. Her name came last, freighted with a job that sounded routine. Maintain observation, log conditions, report any change. She clicked once in acknowledgement and rolled her shoulders so the stock seat settled deeper, a craftsperson's adjustment. The air thinned a fraction, the kind of thinning a body feels but a sensor would dismiss as noise. She felt it anyway. When the sun finally touched the far serration of rock, the wind did the thing she'd written in the box. It softened, not entirely, not like a switch, but like a breath before a word. The mirage lowered. The edge lines stopped swimming. The world held still in the way a hand holds still when it's about to draw a letter. Elena breathed in, let half of it go, and kept the rest. Far behind her, inside a tent, an alarm beeped once, in a tone that meant nothing to anyone who didn't live with radios. It repeated, louder. Boots hurried. The weather vane hesitated at 9, and then swung through 10 with intent. The net snapped, all stations stand by. Possible change in adversary posture. Elena didn't look away from the glass. She let the breath out and took another, storing the room's insult in the same place. She stored her father's instructions where it could burn clean and steady. The mission was moving whether anyone wanted it to or not. She wasn't in charge of the call. She was in charge of being ready when the wind told the truth. That, at least, belonged entirely to her. And as the valley's heat bled off the stone and the white of the day resolved into the finer grey of a world about, to be tested, she felt the line between math and fate tighten into something you could almost pluck like a string. Phantom, the radio said, the commander's voice neither warm nor cold, only exact. Hold your glass, we may need your eyes. She answered with a single word that carried everything she'd already written, and everything she hadn't said aloud. Copy. The dust never truly settled on the ridge. Long after the meeting had broken and the first deployment had scattered, the air remained. Unsettled, stirred by boots, by vehicles, by nerves that had no chance to rest. Elena Cruz lay flat in her hide, the stock of her rifle molded against her shoulder. The valley, stretching out like a living diagram of everything she had just written on that whiteboard. Below her, the SEAL team moved with precision, weaving between rocks, staying low where the shadows gave them cover. She tracked them without raising her barrel, noting only how the environment responded to their presence. Eddies of dust when a man shifted, the sudden alarm of a bird flushed from its perch. Every disturbance was a reminder that the valley itself was alive, and alive things never gave gifts without a price. Through her earpiece, chatter came clipped and efficient. Maddox's voice was constant, directing Rios forward, repositioning the flanking element, calling for silence when sensors picked up movement ahead. Elena listened, spoke only when asked for confirmation of wind, light, or line of sight. Each time she gave her read, she could feel the pause on the other end. They heard her data, but not all of them trusted the conclusions. The strike element reached a ridgeline, preparing to slip into the narrow approach. That intelligence had marked as a possible blind spot in the enemy's perimeter. For a moment, everything felt too smooth, too exact. Elena tilted her scope to the far side and caught it. Just a glint at the wrong angle, like sunlight bent off a rifle barrel. Left crest 80 meters above your axis, she murmured into the mic. Maddox's tone was skeptical. You're certain? Certain enough that if you keep going, someone else will confirm it with bullets. The words had barely left her lips when the valley erupted. Tracers lanced down from the high ridge, machine guns chewing stone to powder. The SEAL element dove for cover, rocks exploding around them. The ambush had been waiting, patient and silent, until the team exposed themselves in the kill zone. Elena's hands moved before thought caught up. She shifted the bipod, dialed her optic 2 clicks, and let the world narrow again. One of the gunners was visible, not fully but enough, the helmet rim rising above the rock, muzzle flash giving him away. She exhaled, felt the reticle steady, and touched the trigger. The rifle's recoil was crisp, controlled. Through the glass she saw the figure collapse backward, weapon clattering against stone. A gap opened in the curtain of fire. The SEALs seized it, rolling into a depression that took them out of the immediate line. Her radio flared with Maddox again, not shouting this time but tight with urgency. "Overwatch. Confirm hostile neutralized. Target down," she said. "Others repositioning. Watch your right flank." And indeed, another burst cracked from the opposite slope, forcing the team to split. Elena swept her field, searching for the source. A muzzle spark betrayed the second shooter. The range was shorter than she liked, the angle sharper, but hesitation meant casualties. She shifted her weight, nudged the rifle, and pressed off another round. This time the response came instantly. The enemy guns stilled, rounds spraying wild into the sky as the man behind them toppled. In the sudden lull, the valley seemed to breathe again. Maddox's next command came fast, pulling his team back from the compromised approach. The silence that followed was not relief. It was recalculation. Elena knew what they were thinking down there. The same thing she felt in her. Bones. The approach was compromised, their plan shredded before it began. Without her shots, at least 2 men would be bleeding out in the sand. With them, they were merely trapped, pinned by the certainty that every path in was covered. For the first time that day, she heard Maddox's voice without the steel mask. "Phantom, good work." No hesitation, no backhanded qualifiers, just that. She allowed herself the smallest nod, unseen by anyone. But the battle was far from over. The enemy had revealed a fraction of their defense, nothing more. Elena scanned the horizon, watching for the subtler signs, the way heat shimmer bent in unnatural ways the outlines of rocks that might conceal sensors, the faintest reflection of glass where an observer might be watching back. Hours stretched. The team withdrew to safer ground, dust caking their gear, their movements slower now, more deliberate. Rios glanced up at her hide once, his face unreadable from that distance. Whether resentment, grudging respect, or simple fatigue, she couldn't tell. What she knew was that he had felt the benefit of her calculations when the ridge lit up. When night finally brushed its edge across the plateau, Maddox called a temporary hold. They would wait for new orders, new options, because charging forward had already proven fatal. Elena remained prone, scope pressed to her eye, watching the valley until her vision blurred and cleared again. She replayed the sequence in her mind, not the kills, but the way the air had shifted just before she fired. A stray gust had tugged the mirage upward, distorting the target's outline for half a heartbeat. Had she squeezed a moment sooner, the bullet would have slipped wide. It wasn't luck that kept it true, it was the discipline to wait that fraction. Longer, to let the environment settle into the narrow band she trusted. Down in the valley, the team made camp in silence, conserving words. Above them, Elena stayed in her solitude, her presence marked only by the cold gleam of a scope and the quiet confidence that had already saved lives that afternoon. Tomorrow the fight would resume, and so would the doubts. Maddox had acknowledged her once, but acknowledgement wasn't trust. That would take more than 2 shots under pressure. It would take the impossible. And somewhere in the fortified compound across the valley, Victor Orlov's preparations ticked closer to completion. Elena wiped her scope, reset her charts, and steadied herself against the knowledge that the hardest test had yet to come. The ridge was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight. Down in the draw, the SEALs regrouped, stripping dust from their weapons, checking straps, trading canteens with movements so restrained they might as well have been shadows. The ambush had rattled them. Not in the sense of panic, men like these didn't break that way, but in the subtle ways seasoned soldiers revealed fatigue, longer pauses before speaking, eyes scanning the dark spaces more often, breaths held a second longer than needed. Commander Jonathan Iron Maddox stood a few paces from his team, helmet clipped to his belt, arms folded across his chest as if he could keep the world out by sheer force. He wasn't a man given to reflection in front of others, but the set of his jaw told its own story. For nearly 2 decades he had thrived on clarity, clear targets, clear rules of engagement, clear men under his command. Yet here, on this plateau that seemed to tilt toward chaos with every gust of wind, clarity was slipping from his grasp. He glanced once toward the rise where Elena's position was hidden, then back at his operators. Maddox had never been a fool. He knew what had kept 2 names off the casualty list that afternoon. But knowing it and embracing it were different things. Admitting that someone outside his doctrine, outside his trusted circle, had altered the outcome, that required a humility he wasn't ready to show. Daniel Rios leaned against a boulder, wiping grit from the action of his rifle. He wasn't green, far from it. Iraq and Afghanistan had carved skill into him the way water carved stone. But his longest shots, the ones he still told in low tones to younger snipers, belonged to a world where distance was measured in hundreds, not in miles. He looked calm, but beneath the surface ran a current of something harder. The knowledge that another set of hands had outperformed him today, that truth stung more than the grit in his eyes. When the call came to reposition, Maddox made his decision with the same crispness that had built his reputation. "We hold here tonight," he told his men. "Rios stays primary. Phantom remains secondary." The word secondary came out like iron filings scraped against steel. Elena, listening from her perch, made no comment. She only logged the weather, marked the subtle fall of temperature as evening laid its veil across the rock, and noted how the air moved differently once the sun no longer struck the valley floor. Silence was her weapon as much as the rifle resting on its bipod. The night hours stretched. Stars pricked the sky, sharp as glass. The compound across the valley glowed faintly, not with lights. They were careful about illumination, but with the eerie pulse of activity sensed rather than seen. Even from this distance, Elena could tell the defenders weren't sleeping. Neither was Victor Orlov. Inside the facility, intelligence suggested technicians were assembling final components. Orlov himself, a man whose mind had been sharpened by Cold War paranoia and then twisted by betrayal, was orchestrating each step. He had no uniform, no medals, no chain of command to answer to. What he had was intent, a plan to ignite a firestorm between nations by pressing one button and letting suspicion do the rest. Back on the ridge, Maddox pulled out a folded map, its edges softened by sweat and constant handling. He crouched low under a red lens flashlight, tracing possible ingress routes with his finger. Each path was a dead end. Anti-air defenses ringed the perimeter, overlapping like scales. Ground approaches bottlenecked into firing lanes already blooded by their last attempt. Time was running thin, and every line he drew seemed to tighten the noose rather than loosen it. Rios joined him, pointing out a slope he believed could give him a shot if he advanced far enough under cover. Maddox studied the terrain sketch, shook his head. Too exposed, too slow. He didn't say what both men knew, that the only one who had demonstrated the ability to thread a bullet through this kind of environment was the person sitting outside the circle of their trust. Meanwhile, Elena recalibrated. She drew her own maps in a notebook, pages filled with angles and arcs that others might see as meaningless scrawl. To her, they were a language as familiar as breath. When a small flock of birds cut across the sky, wheeling south in ragged formation, she paused. They weren't just shapes against the dark, they were markers of invisible airways. Patterns like those confirmed her earlier observations. There was a corridor of relative calm at predictable intervals, a narrow margin of order hidden inside chaos. She keyed her mic once, speaking low. Wind shift in 30 minutes. Expect downdraft along the East Ridge. If anyone's exposed, they'll be silhouetted. Maddox acknowledged with a curt copy. That was all. But he adjusted his men accordingly. The hours ground on. Tension wrapped the camp like barbed wire. Even the most seasoned operators grew heavier under the knowledge that tomorrow meant another attempt, another dance with an enemy who already knew they were coming. Maddox walked the perimeter more than once, boots crunching, mind restless. Rios cleaned his rifle until it gleamed under the thin red glow. Elena stayed at her glass, watching, calculating, never ceasing. And then, just before dawn began to hint at the horizon, a signal came through secure. Channels, satellite imaging had detected intensified movement within the compound. Vehicles clustered near the silo doors. Orlov's people were preparing for something decisive. The order that followed was simple and chilling. Prepare to prevent launch at all costs. Maddox stood rigid as he relayed the message to his men. For the first time, a trace of hesitation cracked his voice. He masked it quickly, but not before Rios heard it, not before Elena heard it through the comms. She lowered her scope, flexed her stiff hands, and let her gaze drift once across the valley. The mountain air smelled of stone and frost. She thought of every equation she had scribbled, every correction she had tested, every moment spent proving herself to people who thought proof came only from tradition. When the commander called for readiness checks, she answered in the same tone she always used, calm, even, unshaken. Inside, though, she understood what the others hadn't yet admitted. The next move would demand more than courage. It would demand the impossible, and she was the only one preparing to attempt it. Dawn spread over the plateau like a blade being drawn from its sheath. The light came cold and thin, sharpening every edge of rock and amplifying the silence that lay heavy across the valley. In the compound opposite, faint movement stirred. Shapes clustered. Near the silo doors, vehicles repositioned in deliberate patterns. For Victor Orlov, the morning was a countdown, not a beginning. From her perch, Elena Cruz observed the subtle choreography through her optics. Mechanics hurried across open ground with the urgency of men who knew they were completing history's ugliest equation. Pipes hissed. Hydraulic arms shifted with the slow inevitability of machinery designed to launch devastation. She made notes, not with pen this time, but with memory, layering every sight and sound into her mental map. The radio cracked with Maddox's tone. "Phantom, what do you see?" She responded quietly, outlining troop positions, equipment movements, and the rhythm of the facility's operations. Maddox grunted acknowledgement, then returned to his inner circle. Orders filtered down, adjust angles, prepare fallback positions, reinforce the flanks. They were practical commands, the sort Maddox had issued his entire career. But in his pauses, small, barely perceptible, Elena heard something else, uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his authority. Below her, Rios prepared for another attempt. He crouched near a jagged outcrop, rifle balanced, eyes narrowed behind his scope. He had the bearing of a man who wanted redemption, who wanted the next shot to erase the humiliation of yesterday. Yet even from a distance, Elena could sense his frustration, a coiled tension that made precision harder, not easier. The sun rose higher, and with it came the shimmer of mirage. Heat lines bent the air into wavering columns, distorting the silhouettes of the men at the silo doors. Elena measured the distortion, cataloguing it with the practiced patience her father had instilled years ago. The valley was no longer a simple canvas. It was a living, shifting puzzle that only calculation could untangle. Maddox gathered his officers under the shade of a comms tent. The atmosphere was taut, filled with the acrid scent of burned coffee and the murmur of radios. He spread a new set of reconnaissance photos across a crate, pointing out defensive emplacements, tracing potential lines of fire. His tone carried authority, but his eyes betrayed conflict. He wanted a plan built on muscle and aggression, but the battlefield refused to honor that simplicity. A junior lieutenant spoke up, suggesting another frontal push timed with smoke cover. Maddox dismissed it instantly, aware that Orlov's men were watching every obvious path. Another officer proposed drone strikes, but air defenses still clawed the sky overhead, ready to swat down any approach. Options were thinning, and time pressed tighter with every passing minute. Elena kept listening, though her focus stayed on the compound. The birds she had noted the day before wheeled again, their flight path consistent, their wings carving invisible corridors through the turbulence. It was more confirmation, a natural sign that the valley's chaos held rare moments of stability. She keyed the mic once more. "Commander, I have observed predictable air currents. They could be leveraged if someone engages from extreme range." Silence followed her statement, stretching long enough for static to hum. When Maddox replied, his words carried skepticism wrapped in command. "Noted. Maintain observation. No promise of action, just dismissal dressed as professionalism." Still, she wrote the interval in her notebook, a private record of opportunity. If the chance came, she would be ready. The day dragged into harsh noon. Heat clamped down on the ridges, baking the stone until it radiated waves that rippled the air. The SEAL team shifted restlessly in their hides, every man aware that time was their enemy as much as Orlov. Rios attempted a ranging shot on a secondary target, a sentry who had wandered too near the outer fence. The bullet went wide, deflected by the shimmer he hadn't accounted for. The guard ducked back into cover. Alarm raised. Within minutes, spotlights swept the slopes and warning sirens pulsed from the compound. Elena clenched her jaw. She hadn't fired, but she felt the sting of that miss. Every eye turned skyward, scanning the cliffs, searching for threats. The enemy now knew with certainty they were being watched. Maddox cursed over the radio, voice tight. "Hold fire unless confirmed. We can't afford another reveal." His words hit harder than intended. The men obeyed, but morale sagged. Rios lowered his head, anger simmering in the slump of his shoulders. As the alarm subsided, Elena resumed her vigil. Through the scope she caught sight of Orlov himself for the first time. He strode across the platform near the silo doors, white lab coat whipping in the wind, hair silver under the glare of the sun. His presence was theatrical, almost taunting. He paused to speak into a handset, gesturing toward the mountains as though daring his unseen adversaries to act. Even at this distance, his confidence radiated. Elena felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. This was no longer abstract intelligence. This was a man preparing to spark catastrophe with his own hand. Later that evening, as the sky softened into amber, Maddox gathered his team again. Weariness edged every line of his face, but his voice carried the iron conviction that had earned him his call sign. He acknowledged the failures, admitted the risk of pressing too hard, and then laid out the brutal truth. Conventional approaches were exhausted. They needed something different, or they would lose. The officers exchanged wary glances. No one wanted to say the word, but it hovered over them like a shadow. Finally, Maddox said it himself. "Cruz, if your math holds, we may need it. But if you're wrong, we trigger the very disaster we came here to prevent." For the first time, Elena heard concession in his tone. Not acceptance, not respect. Concession. He was a man driven to the brink, forced to consider what he had resisted. She didn't gloat. She simply replied, steady and unwavering, "Then I'll keep refining the calculations until there's no margin left for error." The meeting broke with little ceremony, each man weighed down by the knowledge that the next day might be their last. The camp grew quiet, punctuated only by the rasp of sharpening knives, the rustle of gear being packed and repacked, and the distant hum of generators from across the valley. Elena lay prone again as night crept over the mountains. Her scope revealed pinpricks of light where the compound's defenses shifted, patrols pacing their assigned routes. She noted each change, building a lattice of patterns in her mind. Above her, the stars glimmered, indifferent to the war brewing below. In that stillness, she remembered her father's voice, calm in the thin air of the Sierra Nevada. "Patience is precision. Wait until the world steadies, then act." She breathed those words now like a mantra. Tomorrow, when all other choices had failed, she would embody them. And though Maddox and the others still doubted, Elena knew the truth pressing. Closer with every tick of the clock, the impossible shot was no longer theory, it was inevitability. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No sunrise blaze, just a pale wash of light spilling over the ridges and painting the valley in tones of steel. For the men on Maddox's team, it was another day of waiting, but for Elena Cruz, it was the moment when calculations would either prove true or collapse into failure. The compound across the gorge had shifted into high alert. Patrols doubled, armored vehicles repositioned, and the once subtle hum of machinery now throbbed in steady rhythm. From her scope, Elena could see the final adjustments unfolding, technicians hauling crates toward the silo. Cables coiled like snakes across the concrete floor, guards posted at overlapping intervals. Each detail pressed the reality closer. The launch was no longer a threat, it was imminent. Maddox's voice over the net carried less bark than before, though the weight of command still clung to every syllable. "Steel to all stations. The window has closed for conventional strike. Air remains off the table. We adapt." He paused long enough for his men to sense what was coming. "Phantom, you remain our contingency. Stay sharp." No protest followed. Even Rios, once so certain of his place, kept silent. His expression when she glimpsed him through her scope was unreadable, a mask carved by exhaustion and reluctant acknowledgement. The battlefield had stripped away illusions, leaving only necessity. Elena steadied her rifle again, aligning not with a person but with the geometry of the valley. Wind teased her cheek, shifting in fits, then easing, exactly as she had charted the past 3 days. She adjusted turrets with careful precision, the clicks soft but decisive. Every motion carried the weight of inevitability. Hours crawled forward, the sun climbed, heat blooming across the stone. At midday, the compound erupted in coordinated activity. Sirens wailed, metal doors ground open, and technicians scattered into practice formation. Viktor Orlov emerged once more. no longer the aloof architect but a conductor commanding his orchestra. He shouted orders into a handset, gesturing toward the missile bay as though he already held the world hostage. Maddox's transmission crackled. Command confirms, launch prep underway, Phantom, maintain lock. Elena followed Orlov's movements through her glass. He moved briskly between consoles and engineers, his silver hair stark under the glare. To any other eye he was a blur of motion. To hers, he was a sequence to be anticipated, a pattern to be solved. She tracked not where he stood, but where he would stand when the countdown reached its point of no return. The seals on the valley floor shifted uneasily, pinned by defenses that left them powerless. Maddox clenched his fists, torn between instinct to attack and the reality of futility. Into that tension, Elena's calm voice cut through. Commander, interval aligns with predicted corridor. Crosswind at minimum. Target path holds steady. The line went quiet. Even static seemed to retreat. Finally Maddox answered, each word heavy. Phantom, stand by for possible green light. In her scope, the world narrowed further. She saw the sweat on Orlov's temple as he leaned over a console. She noted the flicker of a red warning lamp reflecting in his glasses. She measured how long it took him to walk the distance between the silo gate and the control stand. All of it layered into her mental lattice. The net pulsed again. Steele, this is command. You are authorized any tactical solution that prevents detonation. Maddox swallowed, his throat working audibly in the silence. He looked to his men, to Rios, then toward the unseen crest where Elena lay. He keyed the mic. Phantom, can you do it? Her reply was steady, not boastful, not hesitant. I've been preparing for this moment since I arrived on this ridge. Every operator froze, waiting. Somewhere across the valley, alarms intensified, signaling the start of the final sequence. Lights strobed, mechanics sprinted, and Orlov raised both arms to signal his team. Elena adjusted one final dial, exhaled half a breath, and let the crosshairs settle on the place she knew he would be 3 seconds after she fired. The valley seemed to contract, every sound dimming except the thud of her pulse in her ears. Maddox gave the order, voice stripped of doubt at last. Phantom, engage. Her finger tightened, the trigger wall breaking like glass. The rifle thundered. The bullet tore into the horizon. 3 seconds hung between salvation and annihilation. The valley held its breath. 3 seconds stretched into a span that felt endless. Every pair of eyes fixed on a future balanced on a single line of flight. Through her scope, Elena Cruz tracked nothing visible, just the trembling shimmer where her calculations told her the bullet must pass. Air shimmered, dust drifted, the world seemed to pause. Then, on the far side of the gorge, Victor Orlov staggered. One heartbeat he was upright, barking orders, the next his body folded, backward as though the ground itself had reached up to claim him. His hand froze inches from the final switch. The control deck erupted. Engineers screamed, scattering like startled birds, some dropping tools, others scrambling for cover. The klaxon blared louder for an instant, then cut abruptly as one of the frightened technicians slammed an emergency override. In the span of a breath, the certainty of nuclear ignition collapsed into chaos. Elena did not cheer, did not even shift position. Her eye stayed on the glass, steady, confirming what instinct and training already knew. She transmitted only 3 words: target eliminated. Sequence halted. On the valley floor, silence ruled. Maddox and his men crouched in the dust, waiting for a detonation that never came. When her calm voice broke the tension, disbelief rippled through them. Then came the release. Sharp exhalations, fists striking helmets. One young operator letting out a shout that echoed against the cliffs. Relief surged like a wave, uncontainable. Maddox, though, remained motionless for a long beat. He had carried doubt into this mission like armor, worn it against her presence, against her math, against the possibility that the unconventional might succeed. Now, with the world intact around him, that armor cracked. His radio clicked on, voice rough, almost reverent. "Phantom, you just saved more than this team. You saved everything." Elena finally lifted her cheek from the stock. Her muscles trembled from hours of stillness, but her expression never wavered. She adjusted her scope once more, scanning the compound. Guards fled deeper into the structure, abandoning weapons. Some raised their hands toward the sky, surrendering to enemies they could not even see. The missile bay stood open, but dormant, a monument to a catastrophe denied. "Steele, confirm facility secure," came command's voice across the network. Maddox straightened, his men already advancing cautiously toward the perimeter. "Copy," he said, moving to clear. Phantom maintaining overwatch. And so she did. Even as victory pulsed through the comms, Elena remained at her post, crosshairs sweeping every shadow. Her shot had been the pivot, but she knew one bullet never ended the work. Security had to follow, weapons disarmed, explosives diffused. Only then could the threat be considered truly extinguished. Minutes blurred into an hour. Explosive ordnance teams arrived by chopper once air defenses were confirmed offline, sweeping the compound for traps. Engineers in protective gear disconnected circuits, dismantled triggers, neutralized volatile materials. Maddox's team took prisoners, their hands zip-tied, their expressions hollow. The enemy's confidence had died with their leader. When at last the all-clear came, Maddox sought her out. He climbed the ridge where she had remained the entire time, boots grinding, stone, until he reached the shallow scrape that had served as her hide. For a moment he said nothing, just looked at the rifle resting on its bipod, the glass still trained on the compound. Then he met her gaze. "I was wrong," he said simply. No qualifiers, no excuses, just the admission that had weighed on him since the first torn page in the war room. Elena gave a single nod. She had no need for vindication. The silence of an intact sky was enough. Yet, hearing it from him carried a different weight, one that acknowledged not only her skill but the blind spot that nearly doomed them all. That night, under a sky washed clean by victory, the camp's mood shifted. Laughter returned in bursts. Food tasted less like rations and more like survival. And the younger men kept glancing toward the ridge with something close to awe. They spoke of the shot in whispers, already shaping it into legend. But Elena stayed apart, polishing her weapon by lantern light. For her, it was never about legend. It was about precision, about bearing responsibility for the one chance that could not be missed. She remembered her father's voice in the mountains, reminding her that one bullet could change the course of history. Tonight she had proven him right. In the command tent, Maddox filed his after-action report with unusual care. He listed her contribution not as support but as decisive. He wrote her name beside words that carried the weight of history, prevented nuclear war. When he closed the file, his shoulders sagged, not from defeat but from humility learned too late. And though the world beyond the mountains would never see the valley as he had, they would one day know the truth in headlines, in debriefs, in medals pinned to uniforms. A woman they once doubted had become the one who steadied her hands when humanity's balance wavered. As the camp settled into uneasy rest, Elena lay back against her pack, the stars. Overhead, a silent reminder that fate often hinged on the narrowest of margins. She closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in resolve. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new doubts, and perhaps new dismissals. But tonight, the earth still turned, cities still slept, and children still dreamed because her finger had pressed true. And for her, that was enough. The world did not erupt in fire, but the aftershocks of one trigger pull rippled farther than any detonation could have reached. By the next sunrise, satellites had confirmed the silo's silence and encrypted channels. Pulsed with reports, the missile remained inert, its warhead intact, its architect dead. For once, intelligence analysts had little to debate. What had almost happened was undeniable, and what had been prevented even more so. At the forward camp, the weight of relief was tangible. Men who had prepared themselves for a last stand moved with looser shoulders, their eyes no longer locked on the horizon with the tension of hunted animals. The victory should have felt complete, yet it arrived shrouded in the knowledge of how narrow the margin had been. Elena Cruz stayed apart from the celebration. She cleaned her weapon with the same ritual precision she had always practiced. Each stroke of the cloth a return to order after the storm. Around her, conversations rose. Fragments of disbelief, raw gratitude, even the beginnings of myth. The younger operators spoke of the shot as if it had been fired by more than human hands, already sculpting it into legend. She let them, though she knew the truth was less romantic. It had not been magic. It had been math, patience, and a refusal to flinch. Commander Jonathan Maddox was slower to adjust. He walked the perimeter at dusk, boots grinding into gravel, replaying every moment from the briefing table to the shot itself. His pride was battered, but in its place had grown something harder to shake: recognition. He had built a career on believing the battlefield bowed only to strength and audacity. Yet on this ridge he had watched an enemy fall because a soldier he dismissed had trusted science over instinct. When he finally approached Elena, he did so without ceremony. "You carried the day," he admitted. "Not me, not my plans. You." She looked up briefly, meeting his gaze. "It wasn't about proving anyone wrong," she replied. "It was about stopping what couldn't be allowed to start." Maddox inclined his head, a gesture that carried more than words. It was the kind of acknowledgement forged only in the crucible of necessity. While the camp processed its narrow escape, far beyond the mountains, governments scrambled. Secure lines between capitals burned hot, leaders demanding explanations, assurances, proof. Grainy satellite images of the Pamir compound spread through classified networks, showing silo doors gaping like broken jaws. Analysts reconstructed the event in hurried briefings. A lone shot from extreme distance had struck its mark at the precise instant required. Skeptics asked if such a thing was even possible. Ballistic experts replayed calculations, shaking their heads before conceding, yes, it could be done, but only by someone who had mastered the environment as intimately as their own heartbeat. For the first time, Elena's name entered files she had never seen. Phantom. Confirmed lethal precision at unprecedented range. Outcome: prevention of global escalation. Her identity, long relegated to the margins of joint operations, was suddenly the focal point of whispered conversations in halls of power. Back on the plateau, the SEALs swept the compound one last time, ensuring every wire was cut, every fuse rendered harmless. Elena shadowed them from her hide, her scope sweeping for signs of stragglers. Though the danger had passed, she refused complacency. Responsibility didn't end with a kill. It extended until every ally was safe and every civilian. beyond the mountains, could live their life unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. When the helicopters finally descended to extract the team, dust spiraled around the landing zone, whipping against faces and gear. The men filed aboard, some clapping her shoulder as they passed, others offering nods that said more than words. Even Rios, who had once carried himself with unshakable pride, paused long enough to mutter, "Hell of a shot." His voice carried neither envy nor resentment, only the grudging respect of a marksman who knew exactly what it took. The ride back to base was unlike the tense insertion days earlier. Engines roared, rotors hammered, yet the cabin hummed with something close to relief. Some closed their eyes, letting exhaustion claim them. Others whispered low jokes, the kind men tell only when they've walked away from death. Elena sat near the ramp, the wind tugging at her hair, her expression calm as ever. She knew the true work was only beginning. At headquarters, the debrief stretched for hours. Analysts wanted every detail, weather reports, firing angle, even the exact type of round she had chambered. She answered plainly, resisting embellishment. To her, the mathematics of the shot mattered more than the mythology already forming around it. The investigators pressed Maddox too, and for the first time in his career, he pointed to another as the decisive factor. Without crews, he told them flatly, we'd be counting casualties in cities, not bodies in a valley. News of the event remained classified, yet rumors bled out. Soldiers spoke to comrades, who passed stories along channels that eventually reached journalists sniffing for leads. Whispers emerged of a woman who had taken an impossible shot and saved millions. Officials denied comment, but denials only fed curiosity. Inside the barracks, Elena remained unchanged. She still woke early, still trained, still wrote numbers in her notebook with the quiet devotion of a craftsperson. Yet those around her looked differently now. Where once they had dismissed her as an anomaly, now they watched with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some sought her advice on ballistics. Others simply gave her space, as though proximity to her might bring clarity. Maddox, for his part, carried himself differently. He no longer barked orders at her across rooms. He listened, even asked. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. The commander, who had once torn her work in half, now built plans around it. And still, Elena felt no triumph. She thought only of how narrow the margin had been, how easily a gust of wind or a heartbeat of hesitation could have altered history. That knowledge humbled her more than any medal could elevate. As the weeks passed, the mission was filed into archives marked with the highest classification. Politicians congratulated themselves in secret chambers, never acknowledging publicly how close the world had come. Yet those who had been on the ridge knew the truth. They had heard the silence of 3 seconds stretch into eternity. They had felt their lungs empty as the bullet flew. They had lived because one person refused to accept that limits were immutable. In the stillness of her quarters, Elena wrote in her notebook once more. She recorded the shot not as a tale of heroism, but as a lesson in precision, wind, drop, timing, breath. She knew others would one day study it, but for her, it was not legend. It was simply proof that patience and calculation could hold back the end, and though the world outside remained unaware, within the quiet halls of the military, whispers grew louder. The phantom stopped the war before it began. The storm of paperwork came first, after-action reports stacked high, stamped with red ink that read, "Eyes only." Analysts dissected every radio call, every movement logged on satellite footage. They examined the geometry of the ridge and the trajectory Elena Cruz had traced in. Her notebook, as though the mathematics themselves might reveal a secret formula. To them, the shot was a puzzle piece to be catalogued. To Elena, it remained what it had always been, a responsibility met at the exact instant it mattered. Recognition, however, could not be contained in folders. Words spread across units faster than classification could suppress it. Operators returning from the mission carried stories, not sanitized accounts but raw memories. They described the silence of the ridge, the moment when even seasoned soldiers doubted survival, and the single report of a rifle that broke despair. Around barracks fires and gym benches, the tale grew. Men who had never met her spoke her name as though they had stood at her side. "Phantom," they whispered, giving the word a reverence usually reserved for fallen comrades. Inside command halls, the mood shifted. Officers who had once dismissed her calculations now leaned forward during briefings, scribbling notes whenever she spoke. Courses at sniper schools added segments on atmospheric layering and crosswind prediction, quoting her data without always attaching her name. Her work spread even when the woman behind it remained a ghost in official accounts. Yet, the transformation was most visible in Commander Maddox, where once he had shut down dissent with volume, he now paused to listen. He began inviting Elena into strategy meetings, not as an afterthought, but as a voice equal to his own. It startled younger officers, seeing the hardened veteran defer in subtle ways, asking for her analysis before finalizing troop movement, requesting her assessment on weather windows. The change wasn't announced, but it was felt. Maddox's authority had not diminished, it had evolved. Rios, too, altered. He no longer carried himself with the brittle pride of someone guarding a title. Instead, he approached her quietly one evening in the mess hall. "I thought I understood long range," he admitted, his fork idle over untouched food. "But I never understood it like you do. Teach me." His request was genuine, stripped of ego. Elena nodded once, and in that simple exchange, a rivalry gave way to mentorship. Beyond the military, the ripples reached further. Intelligence agencies shared fragments with allies, enough to prove that the crisis had been contained. Politicians debated whether to release details to reassure the public or bury them to prevent panic. In the end, secrecy won. The world would never know how close it had come, at least not immediately. But within the circles that mattered, those who planned wars, those who prevented them, the legend of a single bullet carried weight. When Elena was summoned to headquarters weeks later, she expected another round of debriefs. Instead, she entered a hall lined with uniforms pressed to perfection, flags draped in silent witness. Maddox stood in the front row, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. A general stepped forward, medal in hand, and spoke words that would echo longer than the ceremony itself, for action above and beyond duty. For precision under conditions deemed impossible, Staff Sergeant Elena Cruz is awarded the nation's highest honor. The medal was cool against her uniform. Applause erupted, but her eyes scanned the crowd until they found Maddox. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the acknowledgement of a commander who had been forced to see beyond his own limits. Afterward, reporters pressed for comments, eager to transform her into a public figure. Elena answered carefully, always redirecting praise to the team, to the analysts, to those who dismantled the missile. She had no desire to become a symbol, yet she understood that others needed her to be one. For women who had been told they couldn't endure the same pressure as men, her presence at that podium was proof carved in steel. In the weeks that followed, invitations arrived from across the armed forces. Training programs asked her to lecture, to demonstrate the mental discipline required for extreme precision. She traveled from desert ranges to forest installations, carrying her battered notebook, showing younger shooters how to read air currents and light distortion with the same respect others reserved for terrain. Cadets leaned forward when she spoke, their pens scratching furiously, eager to learn the craft that had stopped catastrophe. But Elena never let them forget the weight behind it. A bullet is not just trajectory, she told them. It's consequence. Every calculation carries lives on the other side. She spoke not with flourish, but with calm conviction, the kind that settled into those who listened, deeper than adrenaline ever could. Meanwhile, Maddox's own story shifted. In briefings, he spoke less of brute force and more of adaptability. When younger officers asked him about leadership, he no longer recited lessons of aggression. Instead, he told them about the ridge, about the page torn in half, about the woman he had doubted until the moment she carried the mission. The worst mistake, he would say, is underestimating capability because it doesn't look like what you expect. The irony was not lost on Elena. She had never sought to change Maddox. She had only done her job. Yet in doing so, she had reshaped not just him, but the culture that orbited around him. Still, she remained grounded. Nights found her on quiet ranges, laying prone under starlight, scribbling new calculations. She never let the medal dull her focus. Glory, she knew, was fleeting. Precision required humility. Her impact, however, endured. Tactical manuals began referencing phantom intervals, moments when unstable. Air briefly steadied, permitting shots once thought impossible. Young soldiers spoke of those intervals as though they were magic, not math. Elena smiled when she heard it. She let them believe in myth if it helped them respect the craft. Months later, she stood once more on a ridge, this time not in war but in training. A group of cadets lay prone beside her, scopes aligned with distant targets. The wind gusted and frustration creased their brows as shots drifted wide. Elena spoke softly, guiding them. Patience. The world will tell you when to fire. Wait for it to steady. Minutes passed. Then, one by one, their rounds began to strike home. Watching their astonishment, she thought of her father's lessons in the Sierra Nevada, of Maddox's reluctant nod, of the impossible shot that had silenced sirens. The thread of it all wove together into one truth: the boundaries of human ability were not fixed. They expanded when someone refused to accept dismissal as destiny. And so, even as politicians argued, even as commanders debated doctrine, Elena Cruz lived her truth quietly, a soldier whose calm calculation had preserved a world on the brink, and who now carried that knowledge forward, to ensure others would be ready when history demanded the same of them. Under the pale glow of dawn, the world seemed deceptively calm. In the weeks after the impossible shot, a strange quiet descended over the forward bases, as though the mountains themselves wished to bury the memory of how close humanity had come to destruction. Yet for Elena Cruz, calm had never been simple. It carried responsibility, and it carried echoes. She sat at the edge of a range weeks later, a stretch of scrubland chosen for training rather than combat. The ridgeline here mirrored the valley where Orlov had fallen, though stripped of fear and consequence. Cadets prone on mats lined up beside her, their rifles braced, scopes aligned against cardboard silhouettes set far downrange. She moved among them, quiet in step, speaking rarely but always with purpose. "Don't fight the wind," she told one. "Read it. Let it finish its sentence before you interrupt." They listened, not because of her rank, but because of her record. Rumors had raced through the ranks like wildfire. She had become something larger than a soldier, an example, a caution, a story, told to remind people that preconceptions could kill more surely than bullets. Still, Elena refused the pedestal. She grounded every lesson not in legend, but in discipline. Precision, she reminded them, was never glamorous. It was patience measured in heartbeats. Elsewhere, her story had already been co-opted by strategists and politicians. The classified reports circulated through secure channels, but excerpts bled into policy debates. Some generals argued that long-range precision must now become a central pillar of doctrine. Others grumbled that one anomaly should not redefine war. Behind closed doors, Maddox fought for her legacy. In briefings, he repeated the truth, that muscle and speed had failed, and that what saved the mission was calculation carried out by someone he had once dismissed. Each retelling stripped another layer of arrogance from his voice, reshaping him as a commander transformed by humility. Rios, once reluctant to concede anything, had become her most eager pupil. On evenings, when the camp quieted, he sought her out with notebooks filled with his own scribbles. He asked about angle of departure, about mirage compensation, about the small corrections she seemed to make without thought. Elena shared freely, but always with the same caveat: you can learn the math. What you must learn harder is the patience. He nodded, carrying the words as though they were ammunition of a different kind. Meanwhile, governments scrambled to manage perception. The official line framed the crisis as averted by joint operations, with no mention of the individual who had held the trigger. Yet secrecy was porous. Whispers of the phantom shot spread through circles of intelligence and seeped into media speculation. Analysts on late-night broadcasts debated whether such a feat was even possible. Retired officers scoffed at the idea, only to be contradicted by colleagues who quietly confirmed, yes, it had happened. For Elena, the noise mattered little. She returned each day to her routine, cleaning her rifle, updating weather logs, teaching. The medal pinned to her chest gathered dust in a drawer. Recognition was less important than readiness. What kept her steady was the knowledge that she had not acted for acclaim. She had acted because someone had to, and she had prepared all her life to be that someone. Still, there were nights when the memory returned, unbidden. She would lie awake in her bunk, the ceiling dim above, replaying the 3 seconds when the world seemed to hold its breath. The image of Orlov, frozen mid-gesture, etched itself into her mind. It was not pride she felt, but gravity, the weight of having ended a life to preserve countless others. The mathematics had been flawless, but the consequence was human, and it lingered. Maddox understood that burden in his own way. He checked on her more often now, not as commander to subordinate, but as a man who recognized the solitude of responsibility. One evening he joined her on the range, standing silently as cadets fumbled with wind calls. When the session ended, he spoke quietly. "You gave me back more than my men," he admitted. "You gave me back my faith in what I couldn't see. That's harder to repay." She met his gaze, steady as ever. "Then repay it by listening. Not just to me, but to anyone you'd overlook." He nodded, a man reshaped by a lesson he would carry to every command post he ever stood in again. As months passed, Elena's influence spread beyond the military. Universities invited her to lecture on applied physics and atmospheric dynamics. She declined most offers, but occasionally accepted standing before rows of young minds eager to hear how theory had saved the world. She never dramatized. She explained wind shear and Coriolis effect, then reminded them, equations don't prevent war. People who use them with discipline do. Behind the scenes, her methods became standard reading. Manuals referenced her observations as phantom corrections, footnotes that belied the gravity of their origin. Elite units requested her presence for advanced training, and she traveled from deserts to Arctic ranges, translating the universal language of precision into every environment. Through it all, she remained unchanged in essence. She wore her braid the same way she had on the ridge. She kept her notebooks filled with numbers only she could fully decipher. And when recruits asked why she never seemed proud, she answered softly, "Because pride clouds the shot. And one day your steadiness might be all that stands between silence and sirens." The day finally came when she was promoted, the ceremony staged with quiet dignity. Maddox stood beside her, not as skeptic but as advocate, placing the new insignia on her collar. "Master Sergeant Cruz," the general declared, "for redefining the possible, and for proving that resolve and intellect are as lethal as any weapon." Applause followed, yet Elena's thoughts drifted back to the valley, to the wind carrying dust, to the birds tracing invisible corridors. That was where the truth lived, in the patient observation of a world that whispered if you listened. When the ceremony ended, a young private approached her nervously. "Ma'am," he stammered, "do you really think one person can change history with a single action?" She studied him a moment, then answered, "Not one person, one choice. Anyone can make it if they prepare." Later, as she walked away from the hall, the medal heavy on her chest, Elena felt the paradox of her journey. She had become a symbol, yet she was still the same soldier who preferred silence to speeches, calculation to glory. Her greatest lesson had not been about range or wind or patience. It was about perception. She had been underestimated, dismissed, even ridiculed. And yet, when the moment demanded, she had steadied her hands and changed the course of nations. Night fell, and the stars brightened above. She found herself once more on a ridge, rifle cradled, the world vast and fragile around her. She breathed deeply, felt the rhythm of the earth in her chest, and whispered the words her father had taught her long ago: "Precision is responsibility." She smiled faintly, alone but content. History might record her as a legend, but she knew the truth. She was simply a soldier who had listened when the world demanded silence, who had waited when others rushed, and who had pulled the trigger when no one else could. And because of that, the world still turned. They mocked her, they doubted her, they tried to bury her beneath their laughter, convinced she would never rise above the noise. But Elena Cruz did not answer with words. She answered with silence, with patience, with a single choice that turned the impossible into reality. When others rushed, she steadied her breath. When arrogance blinded the battlefield, she read the wind. And when the world teetered on the edge of chaos, she pulled the trigger no one else could. It wasn't pride that guided her. It wasn't glory that drove her. It was responsibility. A belief that precision is more than skill. It's a promise to those who cannot defend themselves. They called her a phantom, a legend, a name whispered in briefings. But she remained what she had always been, a soldier who refused to underestimate the quiet strength within herself. And that is why her story matters. Because every one of us faces a moment when the world will doubt us, when we will be told we don't belong, when the weight of expectation feels too heavy to bear. In that moment, remember, Elena, remember that silence can carry more power than shouts, that patience can outlast arrogance, and that one steady hand can change the course of history. This is more than a tale of war. It is a reminder that the strongest battles are often fought within, and the greatest victories come not from pride, but from discipline. So, I ask you now, what will you do when it is your turn to face the impossible? Will you fold under the weight of doubt, or will you breathe steady and take your shot? This is Veteran Biker. If Elena's story moved you, if it lit a fire in you, don't let it stop here. Comment below, share your thoughts. Tell us what you would have done on that ridge. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like, subscribe, and ride with us every week. Because legends are not born. They are made in the silence by those who dare to act when no one else will.